Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time for your weekly Lovecraft. This week we're going to look at the Dunwich Horror. This is a story published in 1929 that several people have told me is their favorite Lovecraft story, or at least among their favorite, and it's easy to see why. It is indeed one of my favorites. It's one of his later works. It's a little bit longer. It's about 10 chapters worth of material, and I really like it because it steps outside a little bit of what Lovecraft's normal style is compared to his other stories. First of all, it's written in the third-person perspective rather than the first-person perspective. He tends to write more often in the first person than the third person. Third-person perspective is describing things as an external observer rather than giving your personal narrative. And there's some distinct advantages, especially with this kind of story. The main advantage is when you're in the third-person perspective, you can provide many more different angles of insight to the reader to help them figure out what's going on. And because there's a lot of subtlety in what is actually happening in this particular story, that third-person perspective really allows the reader to have a good idea of what is actually going on and where the story is going. It also allows Lovecraft to change the focus and the geographical location of the narrative between chapters. So the book actually starts off with just a description of this area in New England called Dunwich, and then it goes on to describe the birth of this Whately character on Candlemas, which is observed by the residents under a different name, meaning a little bit of a hint that they worship the old gods or they're into some rather strange occult traditions. Later in the story, it shifts to the perspective of this Dr. Armitage, this professor at the university, and what he's doing in order to counter the Dunwich Horror. So the advantage of the third-person perspective is that you can really give the reader a lot more insight. Now, he could have written first-person perspective in several different areas, but I think it works better just him focusing on the third person. And indeed, when you are describing something like Whately, the sort of monstrous youth that grows into a giant that's like 7 feet tall, that's continually described as goat-like, you can't really have a first-person perspective that's intimately familiar with what he's doing. In fact, the whole point of this family is that they're separated even from this very strange community of Dunwich. They are even weirder, to the point where Old Man Whately, who's the boy's grandfather, is described as a wizard and has wizarding kind of books and copies of the Necronomicon that are constantly trying to be dug up and figure out the secrets of. So the third-person perspective works really well. And as a result, that also creates different elements of style. Normally, you're looking at a first-person perspective from the past, is what some of his more famous stories like Call of Cthulhu do. In this case, you're really kind of in the present, and you can see things happen over time, long space of time, 17 years, rather than somebody remembering a couple of months or recalling something from the distant past, things like that. Really, it broadens the narrative from a focus on just a narrow group of events that happened in the past to a large spectrum of events. One thing that I thought was interesting that he did with his use of perspective is during the climax of this particular piece, and if you haven't read it, obviously you should read it. It's in the public domain, so you can read it for free, and it's a great Lovecraft monster story. In the climax of this piece, you have the perspective not focus on the heroes of the story and their actions to try to stop the Dunwich Horror, but on the reactions of the townspeople as they watch from a distance what's going on. I found this to be a very interesting decision, not one that I would have made. As an author, I would have put myself right in the action and really let it be visceral with the reader and let the gore kind of unfold for them. But Lovecraft, for whatever reason, decides to separate that so that the action is obscure, so that the action is a little bit not as visceral, but you can see the reactions of the people. One of them is where they finally are able to see the Dunwich Horror due to the use of some powder device. The Dunwich Horror is invisible. It's some gigantic invisible thing. And so rather than having him directly describe the monster, he describes it secondhand. He has a character look at the monster through a telescope and then kind of describe it that way as some fleeting glimpse of his perception of this horrible tentacle monster with weird elephant feet and who knows what else, eyes everywhere. It's a great way to describe it so that you can give a short, focused description that's a little bit separated from what it would actually look like if you were to draw it on a piece of paper. That allows the reader, kind of similar to what he's done in the past with other things, half describing what's there or slowly giving you the details. It lets you in your mind as a reader imagine something more horrible than if he were to describe it in literal terms. So I actually think that element is effective. But it did end up with a little bit of an anticlimactic feeling because we were separated in distance and from the action, from the actual conclusion of what's happening with the story in the Dunwich Horror. Nevertheless, I think it's a really good story, and it's a very good narrative despite this rather odd choice. And I get some of the reasons I think why he made it, is so that you can imagine things a little bit more dark. Sometimes over-describing will remove some of the tension or the creepiness of what you're trying to get at. Now, one of the things that I think he does very well in this story is that he slowly unfolds the inhumanity of this character called Whately, right? This child of his name's Wilbur Whately, and he's the child or the grandchild of Old Man Wizard Whately, right? Where he's born on Candlemas, and no one knows who the father is, but the grandfather always describes the father as a great man, something like that. And so right away you understand that the fathering of this child is probably something that is not natural, and you start to come up with lots of different solutions as you're reading. This is something that is effective in mystery writing, is that you don't give all the details and people start to write their own stories as they're reading, their own solutions to the problem. Like maybe it was a cultist, some weird guy, and then we get the actual revelation of his fathership at the end of the story, and I'll go ahead and read it to you because it's a great little passage of prose. But as to this thing we've just sent back, the Whateleys raised it for a terrible part in the doings that were to come. It grew fast and big from the same reason that Wilbur grew fast and big, but it beat him because it had a greater share of the outsideness in it. You needn't ask how Wilbur called it out of the air. He didn't call it out. It was his twin brother, but it looked more like the father than he did. That's the end of the story. And what a great ending to this solution of where did Wilbur Whately come from? Where did Whately, who's his father and what's the solution? Well, his father obviously is some sort of outside creature, some sort of old god, some sort of eldritch horror somehow created and impregnated his mother. And indeed, his mother disappears mysteriously, and you never find out the details for that either. So when you don't give all the details, the reader will often conjure up meaning that is more terrifying than if you'd given all of the details. That's an important lesson. The way that Whately's described as growing up is he grows really fast, and he's intelligent beyond his years. And he's always compared to a goat, to the point where when you see him as a fully grown person, like as a teenager, he's like 7 feet tall, he's gaunt and bent, he looks weird, he has strange hair on his face. He's always described as having a goat-like gaunt to him. And when you finally have the revelation of what's wrong with him, it's quite a horrific scene, because what happens is he tries to break into this library in a desperate attempt to get this book that he needs. I'm sorry if there's spoilers, but there's going to be a little bit of spoilers in order for me to analyze this. And when he dies, that's finally when the people are able to see him unclothed to a certain extent. He's grown more horrific than he was. And so his inhuman parts are finally described. I'm not going to describe them for you. You should get them by seeing it in the book. But you finally get to see his parts described. And Lovecraft, unlike the Climax, really doesn't shy away from describing exactly how strange and horrific it is. And the characters that are there, Armitage and the others, they're very, very disturbed by the presence of him and what he actually is. And that becomes the catalyst for them to set in motion their own plans, which makes up the third act. This story can be divided structurally into 3 acts. I know it's 10 chapters, so you can think of it as 10 little structures. It begins with an exposition that's purely a description of the place to set the mood. This is different from what you would probably do in a contemporary setting where you would start with action and characters. He starts with the place and the mood, the emotion that you need to feel. Then you have more exposition of the Whateleys themselves, giving little hints as to what's going on. And that really makes the first act. It's pure exposition with very little action and very broad and semi-mysterious ways of revealing the characters. The second act is an kind of the expounding of the first act and the setting in motion and the slow revelation of just what's going on. They're modifying the farmhouse. The Whateleys are boarding up the windows. They're buying cattle, and the cattle are disappearing. So it's inviting the reader to come up with solutions for this mystery, whatever horrible thing. So you come up with this idea that they're feeding some kind of horrible thing in the attic of their house, in the upper story of their farmhouse. And then the third act, really, you finally have a protagonist. So you don't really have a hero character, I should say, until the third act, where you have Armitage, after having reacted to Wilbur Whateley when he is in search for this copy of the Necronomicon. After having reacted to him, finally that third act is about him and his associates at the university actually taking action to save Dunwich and to save just people from what has actually happened, to investigate and then finally solve the problem of the Dunwich Horror. And so in that way, it's kind of like a 3-act structure. I think it would actually make a decent movie, but I think today's not movie-going audience, but maybe movie producers would find it just a little bit too different from the normal structure because you're not beginning with a character. If you were to adapt this to a screenplay, you'd have to put more Armitage at the beginning so that the audience readily identifies him as a hero in order to get it made. But I would probably just make it the way that it is and let it be really different from what you normally see. But it reads very different from what a normal story would be, where you have a hero at the beginning and then he goes and does actions and solves a plot. Rather, the plot emerges slowly like the horror itself. And I find that very interesting. Most of the plot happens in the last third of the story. So that's it. That's the Dunwich Horror. It's a really cool story. I recommend you check it out. If you're interested in my books, of course, you can read my fantasy books. The newest mini book is Crown of Sight here. This is kind of a dark fantasy tale that has some metaphysical ideas in it that I think are quite interesting and fun. You can find that on Amazon. It's 99 cents for the ebook. Newest story, which is more Lovecraftian. It's like Lovecraft meets aliens. It's called Voices of the Void. You can get that for free if you hop on my mailing list, dvspress.com/list, and you will be able to get that one for free. Or you could pre-order it on Amazon right now. It will come out on the 23rd officially. So the pre-orders definitely help me. That's a way that you can support the channel, is to buy a book. If you're not interested in horror, you can buy one of my fantasy books or my science fiction books or my samurai book, Muramasa, whatever interests you. But if you do like the horror stuff, please do support Voices of the Void. I had a very interesting time writing that particular piece. It was written entirely after midnight. I'd say definitely entirely after 11 p.m. at night, mostly after midnight, because of the way that my schedule worked around the time that I wrote it. I'll talk more about that in another video when I promote that particular piece a little bit more. But in the meantime, you can get it for free, and I'll see you guys next time.